piece of art in the background.
It's by Lucio Poletti.
Nice. All right, it seems we are live. That's perfect.
Great.
Welcome everyone to this Learn Liberty talk. Today we have a very exciting topic and an even more exciting guest with us, who is none other than Alex Gladstein. And he and I will be talking about how Bitcoin helps the fight for human rights. And Alex is the Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation, which is a fantastic organization that has impact all around the world and actually puts together and honest to God, the best event that I've ever attended. And I attend events for a living. But the Oslo Freedom Forum, which not only takes place in Oslo, but also coming up in Miami. What's the date, Alex?
October 4 and 5.
October 4 and 5. Is really fantastic. They bring together business people, journalists, politicians, think tank leaders, lawyers, but then, of course, also human rights activists in order to really make a difference for human rights. So it's very much bottom up. They don't rely on just like government institutions to try to fix human rights around the world, but it's a truly bottom-up approach, and it's fantastic. And Alex is working for the Human Rights Foundation for quite a while and has a huge impact. He has written for The Guardian, CNN, BBC, New York Times, Time, The Wall Street Journal, and so many other outlets. And recently he focused, or the last few years, he's focusing a lot on Bitcoin specifically and how Bitcoin can help human rights efforts around the world. And that's the reason I'm so excited to have you here today to talk to our network.
Thanks for having me. I've been a big fan of SFL and what you all are doing to promote freedom around the world. So pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So let's start off because Bitcoin is around for over a decade now. And most people probably have like somewhat of a vague notion what Bitcoin is. But to get everyone on the same page, you're an expert. How would you describe what Bitcoin really is in 30 seconds?
Well, in 30 seconds.
Maybe you give you a minute.
I'll take a minute. Look, in the 1980s, people realized that the surveillance state was going to be something that kept growing more and more powerful. And they realized that we couldn't just ask governments for freedoms, that we'd have to actually seize them with open source code. So the first innovation was essentially encryption, the ability to send a message privately from one person to another. That was achieved, in a consumer way between two PCs in the early 90s by Phil Zimmerman, who created PGP. And that has given rise to encryption in e-commerce and also our ability to privately message each other with apps like Signal today. But the holy grail of these people, these cypherpunks, these activists, was always digital cash, was always money that the government didn't control. And there were many innovations in the 90s and 2000s, but it wasn't possible until Satoshi Nakamoto invented Bitcoin. And the key thing you have to understand about Bitcoin is that it's digital gold and digital cash at the same time. It's digital gold because no government can change the monetary issuance. It's extremely scarce. You have to put in a lot of work to generate it. And no powerful billionaires or coalitions or oligarchies can change the way that Bitcoin is issued. They cannot change its monetary policy. But it's digital cash in that you and I can just interact with it, right away, immediately. And, it has that bearer asset quality. And through the Lightning Network, it actually is instant and is faster than any sort of Visa or existing fintech. And, when you really start to look at Bitcoin carefully, you realize all the other fintech is dinosaur technology. Like this is allowing people today around the world to share value instantly across borders without permission in a parallel economy, in a money that can't be demonetized or debased, that can't be censored, that can't be remotely confiscated, and can't even be very easily mass surveilled. So this thing is like the money of the future. And I think it's the most important tool we have to preserve liberty in the digital age.
I love that description. And it's really remarkable. Once you start using Bitcoin, you realize like, hey, it's not only money that you can transfer within 10 minutes all across the world for very little fees. You are actually your own bank. You don't have to ask anyone for permission. And that is really a truly remarkable thing.
Well, and the Lightning thing is important, though, because dude, screw the 10 minutes. Like Lightning is instant. Like it's faster than any Apple Pay or any technology anyone's ever invented. When I send Lightning to you, it's instant. I mean, I was talking to somebody in Ramallah the other day, and I was in Boston, and I sent them Lightning, and it literally was instant. I mean, this is for a person who has to deal with a lot of blockades and delays and, fees and all sorts of stuff, checkpoints, confiscations, investigations into their whatever. No. I could just send them money instantly, peer to peer. We're doing this in a non-governmental way. Like the government is over there. We're like over here. This is a human interaction. We're going person to person. And I just think that's beautiful.
Absolutely. And that's already like a good insight to have, that there's like the settlement layer, which is Bitcoin, but there can be like a lot of different layers on top of that. And Lightning is one of them. And there's a lot of innovation and a lot of development power just focused on those things as well, which is exciting. All right. But still to this day, many see Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency as like a speculative gimmick. Can you explain like why does Bitcoin really matter for human rights?
Sure. Well, to address why they view it as a gimmick, that is only really possible if you have financial privilege, which is an important term and topic to discuss. Like, so 13% of the world has both access to a reserve currency, meaning they were born into a country whose currency is strong enough that other nations will save in it. So we're talking the dollar, the euro, the pound, the Swiss franc, the Australian and Canadian dollars, and the yen. Okay, these are strong currencies. Okay, these are what we call reserve currencies. And then at the same time, under a liberal democracy. So only 13% of humans in the world have property rights secured by liberal democracy and a reserve currency. The other 87% of the world, either has a weak currency or lives under an authoritarian regime. So for them, like the money system doesn't really work. And there's a lot of people, probably not so much listening to us, but like generally speaking, there's a lot of people who view money as a creation of the state. Okay, that's your viewpoint. The state creates money, chartalism or whatever. That's not a great deal. That's not a nice arrangement for the 53% of the people in the world that live under an authoritarian regime. Like that's not ideal. Like we do not want that to happen, right? So there's a lot of people will like bang their head against a wall, literally, like in a puzzling way, trying to argue that money can only be created by the state. And I'm kind of over here saying, go ahead, bang your head against the wall as much as you want. We're over here using money that's not created by the state. Like we're over here proving you wrong, right? So, argue as much as you want in the theory land. Like we're here in practice, literally using a different monetary system that governments don't control. So I think the financial privilege thing is important. Most of the critics of Bitcoin live in the West, enjoy Venmo, PayPal, the dollar, the S&P 500, Amazon stock. It's easy for them to invest in real estate, open a bank account, have a credit card, send money to family. And they're like, well, why would you be using Bitcoin? It seems like this sketchy thing for criminals. Like, okay, you talk to somebody somewhere else, in Eastern Congo, in Venezuela, in Gaza, in wherever, in most places in the world, their money's broken. It's horribly broken. In Sudan has 340% inflation. Nigeria, 20% inflation. So people live in places that either have extremely high inflation, high food inflation, or, they're disconnected from the outside world through sanctions or through things that they didn't, deserve. Like you're a citizen of Iran, or Cuba, like you didn't do anything in particular to deserve an embargo against your country. Like that's the fault of your dictators who you didn't even vote for, right? So a lot of people are out there living under financial injustice, disconnected, debased. Oftentimes, like look at India or North Korea or Eritrea, governments do demonetization. They basically say, hey, this cash you guys have, this particular note, we're gonna phase it out. You have like X number of months to turn it in for the new one, and then of course they take a haircut on the new one, right? So this happens all the time, and bank accounts getting frozen, shut down. This is how they went after Apple Daily in Hong Kong. They froze the bank account, then they couldn't operate, right? This is how they tried to go after Navalny in Russia before they actually put him in prison. And his team was able to use Bitcoin to keep going, right? To raise money without the government being involved. This is how the Belarusian democracy movement has sustained itself in no small part is through Bitcoin donations, because the government has controlled the banking sector. This is how the anti-SARS protests in Nigeria last year were in no small part supported through Bitcoin, through the feminist coalition. So around the world, you're watching people fighting for civil liberties, getting cut off from the legacy banking system, which is a system of control. And then they're finding a way out through Bitcoin. So the human rights aspect of it cannot be understated. It's so, so important. Or rather, cannot be overstated. It's very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think those are numbers, estimates I've seen as 1.2 billion people that live in 2-digit or 3-digit inflation.
Yeah.
Where they see their savings erode every single day.
Yeah, it's not just Venezuela. I mean, we in Venezuela is very important. I mean, there's just 25 million people. I mean, it's a proud nation that we should all try to support. This is a place that the rest of South America used to flee to get away from these crises, and now they're the ones fleeing. And it's the world's largest refugee crisis by some measures today. But Venezuela is just one country. We're talking massive countries that have huge inflation. I mean, Pakistan, Turkey, Nigeria, Ethiopia. I mean, we're talking historically speaking, places like the Philippines, Argentina. I mean, some of these countries have 10, 20, 50, 100, 500, 4,000% inflation, right? So this is not like some niche phenomena. More people suffer under double and triple digit inflation than the number of people that the UN considers to live under abject poverty, or the number that the UN considers who don't have access to clean drinking water, or the number that the UN considers without a toilet. Okay, so these are some of the big issues that people hold these big conferences around the world to solve these problems, which are important problems to solve. You'll never see the UN holding a conference about how to solve inflation. That's not a conference they would have, because that's part of the way they control people, right? Yeah. So, this is an urgent issue. I mean, look at what's happening in Lebanon right now. It is an absolute tragedy, absolute tragedy. There's no amount of virtue signaling we can do in our conversation to even just remotely, console people there. I mean, it's just end times, you know what I mean? So, I mean, this is a brutal system out there, and government control over money is at best not, at best, it's something we can live with, okay, in the West. But at worst, it's a tragedy.
Absolutely, and this is entirely avoidable. Milton Friedman always said, has said that inflation is always and always will be a monetary phenomenon, i.e. it is because of central banks and government control of the money supply. It doesn't have to be like that, and Bitcoin has only 21 million Bitcoin. There will never be more, and it has been tested, and it's for sure. So this is really the only good, I would argue, known to mankind that's absolutely scarce, and that makes it a much better money, in my opinion. But some people say and I have a question here in the chat, what value does Bitcoin have that is not speculative? How will it become a store of value when it's this volatile?
I mean, you just got to look at the charts. I mean, look at the facts. I mean, Bitcoin is a store of value is not an accurate term to use with Bitcoin, because Bitcoin does not just store value. Bitcoin appreciates value. Okay, so it does not just preserve your purchasing power. It dramatically increases your purchasing power over time. No fiat currencies do that. The very best of the fiat currencies can, at best, preserve most of your purchasing power over time. And even the very best ones lose 20, 40, 50, 60% over 50 years. Okay, even the very best ones. In 12 years of Bitcoin's existence, I mean, it's gone from a penny to 10 cents to $1 to $100 to $1,000 to $10,000 to whatever it is today, $30,000. Okay, I mean, that's remarkable. No fiat currency will ever do that. So you have to understand that because there is no monetary policy controlled by humans, it is algorithmic, right? It is set in stone. We cannot tweak it. So if there's more demand for Bitcoin, we can't just print more Bitcoin. It's not like a central bank. There is no currency board. And if there's not a lot of demand, we can't restrict the supply. Okay, so that leads to volatility. However, if anyone can just look at the dollar Bitcoin chart over the last 5 years, not the Bitcoin dollar chart, the other way around. I mean, it literally looks like a hyperinflationary collapse of the dollar. And that's what's happening. I mean, the dollar is collapsing against Bitcoin. So it won't be a linear phenomenon. It won't be stable. It will be extremely volatile, but we're going in a particular direction. We're going up and to the right against anything. I mean, against dollars, against yen, against houses, against bonds, which are real negative yielding at this point, against fine art, against every other cryptocurrency over time. We're going up and to the right. That's what Bitcoin does.
Yeah, and of course, none of this is financial advice, it's just educational, but you don't, people sometimes don't know that you don't have to acquire a whole Bitcoin. You can
no one knows the future. I'm just reflecting on the last 12 years. I mean, you just look at the charts, look at the math, folks. I think people have been gaslit by the media into thinking that Bitcoin is risky and dangerous, when in reality, it was risky and dangerous to not have Bitcoin over the last 12 years. Very risky and dangerous. Like, you lost out on a lot, right? So, and it's a joke to people who live in America who are like, oh, well, maybe I'll move some money from, maybe my Apple stock over to my Coinbase. Like, no. There are people who've had their lives completely ruined and devastated by the currency collapse, and they could have saved themselves and their families with Bitcoin. And many did, and many did. Many did. Okay, millions and millions of people today use Bitcoin to escape in Turkey, in Argentina, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia. It's so many different places. So, I mean, Bitcoin is doing more, is out there kicking ass, and is saving so many people today. And it just frustrates me to no end to see these critics in the media like yammering about like whatever complaint they have du jour about Bitcoin. What have they ever done for somebody in Lebanon? Nothing. Nothing. And what can they do? Very little. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of this activism we do, you get very jaded over done this for 15 years. It's very hard to achieve real victories, and we do it, and that's why I'm proud of the work at HRF. But I mean, when it comes to like actually giving people freedom, it's not so easy. But if you teach someone how to use Bitcoin, that's the real deal. They can actually start to achieve real freedom. Like, they can put their time and energy into something that the government cannot confiscate, that can be protected with math. Like, we have this peaceful shield that protects us as Bitcoin. And, it gives them a connection to the outside world. I mean, in a way that they're often cut off. Like, a lot of people are literally just cut off. I mean, if you think about the way that fiat currencies are set up, they're set up to divide us. I mean, it's not like intentional, but like you can't do business here, or you got to go through an exchange and someone takes a cut. Like, Bitcoin is global, borderless, neutral, non-discriminatory. It's money for everybody. Like, it really connects all of us. And I think that's just so powerful.
Yeah, and it's much more efficient because we are paying, I think at this point, 8 or 9 staffers in Bitcoin, and we're doing this since 2015. And it's so much more seamless than using the bank.
Yeah, and it's not just efficient at your level, and we will get into that operationally. Very important for all nonprofits to think about using Bitcoin, but it's geopolitically efficient. Like, when you really think about this is key. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is not a competitor to Visa, and it's not a competitor to Bank of America. Bitcoin is a competitor to the Fed. Bitcoin is a competitor to central banking. That's what it is. So it's at the base layer. It is a central banking layer. It is the actual money itself. Okay. Then on top of Bitcoin, you can build banks, you can build fintech, you can build all kinds of things on top of it, right? Just like on top of fiat currency, you can build the banking system, you can build fintech, all kinds of layers, right? So it's false to compare Bitcoin to Visa. Everybody's like, oh, well, like Bitcoin's so slow. Well, actually, Lightning Network is way faster than Visa and is lower fees. So once you start looking at the layers of Bitcoin, you start seeing how much better they are than Visa. Like, I mean, the number of people who can't wrap their minds, who think that Bitcoin's dumb or bad because it can't do X number of transactions per second. It's like, there's no theoretical upward bound on the number of transactions per second that Bitcoin can do. Whereas there is literally a physical bound on what Visa can do due to like database construction, right? They would have to, it's linear. They would have to build more data centers and more processing power. Bitcoin doesn't work like that. It literally has no theoretical, it's only bounded by the size of the network and the user base. And as that grows, it gets bigger and it gets faster and it gets stronger. So you really have to think about the fact that we need to compare Bitcoin not to Visa, but to central banks. And you want to talk about energy use and negative externalities. I mean, we're talking about Bitcoin wears everything on its sleeve. It's transparent. We can see how much energy it uses. We can see what kind of energy it uses, more or less. We can run studies. Today we know that it looks like more than half of all that energy it uses is renewable, which is kind of remarkable if you're someone who doesn't want to see fossil fuels in our future, right? Now, I know there's a big debate about that, but like clearly there's technology deflation in renewable energy technology, like in solar, wind, etc. It's getting cheaper. And Bitcoin miners who do the transaction processing, who use this energy, they don't care about anything else other than what is the cheapest possible energy I can get. So you're going to see more and more renewable stuff in the future. Now compare that to the dollar system, right? Let's say the Fed, which is kind of like the central banks of all the other central banks. If you noticed last year we had a big crisis, the Fed had to extend swap lines to other central banks because they're like reliant on ours, right? As an American, speaking as an American. So the Fed is based on something called the Petro Dollar, right? So the dollar system that we have today went through many iterations, right? It started, we could go back forever, but I mean, essentially we could just start in 1944. I mean, after World War II, the great powers got together as it looked kind of clear that we were going to defeat the Nazis, and we gathered in New Hampshire, in America, by the way, and determined what the future of the world was going to be with currency. And instead of making a global currency, which John Maynard Keynes wanted to do, right, through the Bancor, like he suggested that like we have this internationally managed thing. The Americans, we got to have our way because we had more gold than anybody else because we didn't get destroyed during World War I. Okay, even though we had the Great Depression, we still had this massive amount of gold. So we had the most leverage, and we were able to get the dollar system set into place where like every other country would use dollars pegged to gold at 35 an ounce, and we would hold the gold, or we and our allies would hold the gold, right? Now this worked fairly well for a while until JFK was assassinated, and like in the 60s, basically we had guns and butter in the United States, right? So we invaded Vietnam, we spent a lot of money there, and we also went on this like huge binge of social programs. So Nixon had to eventually float the dollar. I mean, there was a huge amount of pressure, and other governments weren't trusting us to hold the peg. So the French literally sent a battleship in the summer of 71 to New York City to like get their gold back, to redeem the dollars for gold. So a week later, Nixon went on TV. He gave the Nixon speech, the shock, took us off the gold window. And in the next year and a half, the dollar depreciated against other major currencies by 20%. So the other countries were correct in their fear. We could not hold the peg. And that was due to guns and butter. Okay. Now, that was a big moment in time. Nixon and Kissinger were like, well, what do we do? How do we save the dollar? How can we make sure the dollar remains the reserve currency? So they hired a guy off Wall Street named William Simon, who became the Treasury Secretary. He's a bond salesman, and they sent him to the Gulf, which is interesting because, of course, we were just in a conflict with the Gulf nations at that time, 73. We took the side of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. They embargoed us, right? The price of oil quadrupled in dollar terms. You'll notice it didn't really quadruple in gold terms. It quadrupled in dollar terms, right? So the dollar was like, really crashing. And we had to save it. So basically, Nixon and Kissinger sent Simon to Saudi Arabia to do a deal with them, who, the Saudis had just become the big swing producer at OPEC, right? Which was a new thing. The oil used to be controlled by Europeans and imperialists. And in the 50s and 60s, it became kind of controlled by these, regimes, mainly in the Arab world, right? So they did this deal where basically America would promise protection of the Saudis, and we would sell them weapons at below market prices, okay? And in exchange, at non-market prices, right? They were a non-market purchaser of weapons. They bought so many weapons from us. They're still buying tons of weapons from us. In exchange, they would denominate the sale of oil in dollars. Again, 80% of all the world's oil at the time. And the kicker, which we didn't learn about till later, we kind of knew, but like it wasn't declassified till the 90s, was something called Petrodollar Recycling. So what they would do is with the profits, with these dollars they would earn, they would buy US debt with that. So they would finance our guns and butter. So this is how we did it. They brought in William Simon to sell bonds, and that's how we did it, because Nixon couldn't raise taxes. He was about to get impeached. So how were they going to finance the dollar and make it strong? It was through the petrodollar system. Now, it's evolved in a huge way since, like after 82, the Arab nations no longer really could buy a lot of our debt. So the Germans, the Japanese, over time, the Chinese started buying a lot of it. But on the back end, we had to continue supporting the Saudis in exchange for their promise to only denominate the dollar, rather the oil sales in dollars. And we protected this. We went to great lengths to protect this system. And eventually, it's starting to crumble today. Like 2013, the Chinese stopped buying our treasuries. Like they're dishoarding. Like the Fed buys more than 50% of all of our bonds now. It's a little crazy. So this system lasted for about 50 years, but you have to think about the negative externalities. So when people start comparing Bitcoin to like the existing system, remember the existing system is massively tied to fossil fuels and climate change. I mean, the U.S. military is the world's single largest consumer of petroleum. I mean, and
the biggest polluter around the world,
and the biggest polluter. And you're looking at this, and you're like, well, the Petro Alliance like attacked renewables and nuclear, especially in the 70s and 80s. Like there were countries that wanted to go energy independent through atomic energy, and I mean, conspiracy theory or not, like those leaders died. I mean, one way or another, they didn't make it, and like, we could go into like how involved we were in places like Brazil and Pakistan and stuff, but like it was questionable. So, and certainly there was industrial sabotage and subsidization of the and corruption inside the petro industry. And it continues. I mean, dude, it continues to be staggering. So, I mean, just the amount of money these people make. I mean, I ran across a study most recently that really blew my mind. I'll leave it for you for the show notes or whatever, but it was a look at basically the S&P 500, and it was a look at the performance of the oil companies, the 7 biggest oil companies versus the rest of the S&P. Okay, and when this is over 50 years, when the performance of the oil companies versus the differential performance versus the rest of the stock market was down, there was a war in the Middle East. And it's like incredible how correlated it is. And, what does that mean? I don't know. You all can go dig into the data. It's incredible, though. You just look at this chart and you're like, oh, my God. So we could go way down that rabbit hole. But the point is, our dollar system, which powers all the other central banks, has negative externalities that include support for the dictators, support for Saudi, massive support for the fossil fuel industry, war abroad, and a huge trade-off domestically too. Like this whole system is reliant on basically a strong dollar, which means that we can't really export competitively, which means that our like middle class got like hollowed out and sacrificed to the coastal elites over the last 2 decades. So if you're in technology or defense or services or something like that, insurance, banking, you've killed it over the last 40 years. Killed it. But the average income of an American is stagnated. And you did not kill it if you were in manufacturing or farming or something like that, right? So it's very tricky. But, when people talk about the costs of Bitcoin, I mean, you have to talk about what it is and what it's competing with, and what are the costs of the existing system. And I would argue that the costs of the existing system are massive, unspoken about. And I mean, we could do way better. Let's put it that way. We could do way better.
Absolutely. And can you describe, you have mentioned like many different instances where Bitcoin was very helpful for human rights effort. Can you maybe tell like 2 stories of people that you've interacted with where Bitcoin was not necessarily just a life raft to escape inflation, but also to escape human rights abuses?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a little tricky. I have tons of stories, but I'll tell a couple. I mean, really, it's a monetary escape, right? So you talk about, I've interviewed people who fled Venezuela with their wealth that they had earned in Bitcoin, and they started a new life somewhere else. I mean, there's a guy who started Ledn, LEDN. It's an exchange based in Canada. He and his brothers back in 2015-16 in Venezuela, in Barquisimeto, I think, that they were mining Bitcoin, and they as young people, they had figured this out, and they were like earning a bunch of Bitcoin, and they eventually had to flee the country for political reasons as refugees. But because they had Bitcoin, some of them had to just go over the border to Colombia by foot, right? So because they were able to store their time and labor into something that was in cyberspace, they were able to actually bring it with them, which is amazing, and they could start a new life. That was obviously not an option for refugees fleeing crises 50, 60 years ago, even 20 years ago, 10 years ago, not an option. Now they can bring their wealth with them. I thought that was quite amazing. I have another friend who's an Afghan entrepreneur. She's one of the first female tech CEOs in Afghanistan. Her name's Roya Mahbub, and about 8 years ago, actually, very early on, 2013, really, she started paying her employees in Bitcoin because they were women in Afghanistan working in the tech sector, like very difficult to pay them. The husbands, brothers, uncles would take the cash, like couldn't open a bank account. So, but they all had phones, so she could pay them in Bitcoin. It gave them a sense of freedom, you know. And one of them actually had to flee Afghanistan, and she brought her Bitcoin with her all the way to Germany. And in the time that by the time she got there, it had appreciated in value pretty dramatically, and it helped her start a new life. So I thought that was pretty cool. But a lot of times it's just like people are stuck, but just having this connection with the world helps them, and it can help them either improve their quality of life where they are or escape. So I talked to this guy in Gaza the other day, and he's been saving up in Bitcoin while the world around him is like being destroyed, essentially. And he's saying it's helping a lot of people in that place escape poverty, essentially. Like, you know, it's a little different than a situation like Venezuela, or a lot different, but the common currency in Gaza is the shekel, is the Israeli shekel. So it's not a currency it's actually really, really strong currency. So the currency itself is not the problem. It's the price inflation. There's so few goods that they get very, very expensive in this region, right? So like a laptop in Tel Aviv is like $1,500, but it could be like $3,000 or $4,000 in the territories, right? Because of all the expenses it has to do to get there. It has to like be stored, it has to be transported, all this stuff. Everybody takes a cut along the way. So you end up having this like huge inflation in goods. It makes things extremely expensive. And then there's just like no connection to the outside world. Like there's like 2 checkpoints basically. So instead, and like forget trying to Venmo or like send a remittance, like almost impossible. So instead, this guy's telling me, I'm talking to him on Telegram, like through a translator, and he's telling me that like people are selling their homes for Bitcoin. And like their strategy is the following: real estate's going to zero there. I mean, they could get bombed. I mean, it could just get destroyed, and there's just not, you can get insurance. So they're like, look, like worst case scenario, Bitcoin goes to zero, and we're at the status quo. Like we haven't lost anything. But they're smarter than that, and they know it's not going to zero, and they're like, this is our ticket out of here. So this guy's saving up, and he's gonna get out. Okay. So he's going to literally achieve his freedom through Bitcoin. I thought that was incredible. So, I mean, those are just a few examples.
Very good. And there's already questions in the chat about this. And let me ask this in 2 different ways.
Sure.
How can we avoid, how can Bitcoin really avoid being captured by the financial elites or by government? Can it not just be forbidden? And in light of that, like recently there was like a massive crackdown on miners, specifically like within China.
Yeah.
Has it succeeded to really curtail the use of Bitcoin in that country? And why would it not happen to the rest of the world?
Yeah. So 2 things. You can't stop an idea. Bitcoin is the idea of money that is not controlled by corporations and governments. You can't stop an idea. It's open source code. It can be replicated. It can be shared. It will live on. It is not controlled by governments and corporations. Many governments have tried to kill Bitcoin. They've all failed, all of them. Many governments have tried to ban it. Instead of reducing the amount of activity, they've increased it. This has happened in India, in Nigeria, etc. Now, what happened in China is actually great for Bitcoin. It's bad for Bitcoin miners in China. Okay, I feel sorry for them. They did a great job. They secured the network for many years, but hey, you know, times change. They're going elsewhere. The CCP has ostensibly basically tried to get rid of all the mining in China. Okay, we don't know exactly why. I think it's a geostrategic blunder that's going to be on par with like Napoleon invading Russia. Like when we look back at this in 50 years, I mean, they had more than half of all the Bitcoin mining infrastructure No, actually about 45%. They had about 40 by April before the crackdown. New data just came out from the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, which charts all the Bitcoin mining usage. It looks like they had about 45% in their borders. Still massive. So now it's gonna be close to zero, right? And all of that is decentralizing to Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Texas, Canada, it's Iceland. It's all just like going elsewhere. This is really, really good for the Bitcoin network because it means that like the threat of a government doing what's called a 51% attack, where they try to leverage 51% of the hash power to like mess with the system, which wouldn't be fatal. It would be temporary and expensive, but it would be annoying and it would definitely crash the price of Bitcoin. No longer going to happen because no one country or even an alliance of countries has that much Bitcoin anymore, hash rate anymore. So it's phenomenal for the network, like breathtaking, actually, that just happened. So, I mean, ironically, let's actually just pause to reflect on the fact that we're not seeing effective bans. We're seeing a government adopt Bitcoin. Like forget bans. Governments are going to adopt Bitcoin. Okay, so we're seeing the government of El Salvador add Bitcoin as legal tender in that country, which the process is ongoing, and it's going to basically start in September. All the merchants are going to be offering Bitcoin, receiving Bitcoin, etc. So you're watching out of self-interest, governments are going to start adopting Bitcoin. So I think this idea of people being afraid that governments are going to like kill it is not in line with what we're seeing. Like we're watching widespread adoption of Bitcoin. I mean, Coinbase just went public in the United States. Okay, we have Bitcoin-friendly regulators in the United States. We have senators in the United States who are proud Bitcoiners who will defend Americans' rights to use Bitcoin. That's just in America. Then you have this developing country that's literally adding Bitcoin as legal tender, and a bunch of other countries are going to follow at some point. So I'm more interested in like a realistic view of what's happening right now based on facts and not fear.
Very good. And the facts speak to that, because if you look at the adoption of Bitcoin, it's growing faster than the internet did back in the day.
Yeah.
So it is already like used by 100 millions of people, and there's a reason why it's being used, especially in countries where they really need it. It's much more than just a gimmick. So what do you think are like the 2 to 3 reasons why people are so reluctant to try to understand it? Because it's very easy to dismiss it, and we see it in the comments right now. People say like, "Oh, it doesn't do anything for human rights. Like this is just a conspiracy."
It doesn't do anything for human rights. So yeah, well, whoever said that, Bitcoin does more for human rights every day than you'll ever do in your whole lifetime. Sorry to break it to you, but that's just the facts. So I think like any new technology, there's a really good Twitter account called the Pessimist Archive. When electricity was invented, when the radio was invented, when the airplane was invented, when the television was invented, when credit cards were invented, when the mobile phone was invented. I mean, when the car was invented, anytime a major innovation comes, people hate it. They hate it. They attack it. They say it's going to change our way of life. It's going to cause cancer. It's going to boil the oceans, whatever. Like they'll come up with a million different excuses. This is because we are conservative people, and our world is a conservative world, and we're reluctant to change, and we're scared of change, and we don't want to be on the edge, and we don't necessarily want to take a risk. Okay, this is baked into every single. I mean, you go back and you look at Bill Gates on David Letterman in 1991, and David Letterman's laughing at him, saying, "Whatever, man, the internet's superhighway. Like that's ever going to come to fruition." I mean, Paul Krugman said that the internet would have less of an impact on the world than the fax machine. I mean, there were still articles. Look, in the late 90s, I was using dial-up modem to freaking play Counter-Strike on. I knew that the internet was going to change the world. And there were still articles in Newsweek when I was 14 years old saying that the internet was going to, do nothing. I mean, nobody believed in Jeff Bezos at the beginning. So, all right. So this is just common in human history. We are skeptical. And that's why all these new technologies follow an adoption curve that's an S curve, meaning it starts for a long time at like very little adoption, and then it has a moment and it goes exponential. So we are, as Wolf said, this is growing faster than the internet. So the best way to look at it is like in 97, 98, you had a smaller world in terms of population, but you had about 2% internet adoption in the world in 1997, 1998. Okay. it was about 150 million people. Okay, now it's 200 million people because the population's grown. Okay, so that's kind of where we are right now. So you got to go back and think about 1997, 1998. Like, that's where we are with Bitcoin. And look what happened over the next 20 years. Like, so you don't want to be sleeping on this. This is not something you want to be ignoring. I mean, how could you ignore it? The thing's worth $30,000. I mean, you don't need to read books or be convinced. Like, there's just truth. There's truth, and then there's debate. Like, the truth is Bitcoin has gone from a penny to $30,000. It has done that because it's extremely valuable to humans, and it will be recognized as such, and it will grow, and you can't stop this movement. And we're lucky to have it, because if we didn't have it, I wouldn't be very optimistic about the world. I mean, we've got the surveillance state on full steroids right now. I mean, they're trying to take everything from us. They're trying to turn our money into central bank digital currency, which is going to be discriminatory, blacklisted, confiscatable, censored. They're going to replace cash with this CB, central bank liability, that can be just like a tool of social engineering. The Fed is talking about it. The ECB is talking about it. The Chinese have already implemented it. Like, that's coming. So luckily we have a plan B. We have an out. We can, like, citizens of the world can unite and opt into Bitcoin. And I think it's better that you start learning about it now than in 5 years. I mean, think about it. Like, even if you only assign it a small chance of doing what I'm saying it's going to do, I mean, okay, allocate accordingly. Like, okay, give it a 5% chance, give it a 3% chance. It's definitely not a 0% chance, given that it's growing faster than the internet. So assign it whatever chance that you think is reasonable, and then act. You know, talk about this to your colleagues. I mean, create a policy. I mean, if you run a nonprofit, start thinking about accepting Bitcoin donations. It's very important. So, I mean, and it's just helped so many nonprofits around the world, whether they're under duress or whether they're just fundraising. Like, look at the Pineapple Fund. Whenever there's like a big expansion in the price of Bitcoin, some people get very generous, and you want to be the recipient of that. Like, you want to receive that Bitcoin, and you want to essentially hold on to it if you can as a nonprofit for 3-4 years. Bitcoin monetary policy is a 4-year cycle. So you really want to hold for 4 years if you can.
Absolutely. And I would always encourage people to read more about it, because it's very fascinating. And I've written a book about against like the Federal Reserve when I was younger, and like this is what makes me sleep at night, knowing that this exists. I think this is the single most promising technology that can like bring liberty, justice, and prosperity to the world. And even if you completely disagree, you should learn about it. But that being said, you know, Alex, that there's like what, 4,000, 5,000 other cryptocurrencies, and everybody and their dog can create one within like 5 minutes. Why should people care about Bitcoin and not the rest of it?
No, I mean, like, look, it's an open market. Feel free to experiment, but you need to understand why Bitcoin is different. Bitcoin is different because it's not fiat currency. That's it. Every other cryptocurrency is fiat. Okay. Every other cryptocurrency has a small group of people who control the rules. Okay. We'll just look at Ethereum, because Ethereum is clearly the second largest, second most powerful, second most famous cryptocurrency. You know, most people should be able to understand that like everything below Ethereum is dramatically less more centralized, more vulnerable, etc. than Ethereum. So let's just look at Ethereum for a second. Okay, Ethereum's monetary policy has changed many times since it was created. Actually, the chart of it looks like a third grader drew it with crayon. It's like pretty funny. Well, not funny if you're relying on this thing for the future of your company or whatever. But the thing is with Ethereum, no one can tell you how much ETH is going to be minted in 2022 or 2023 or 2024. Nobody knows. They're going to do their best to figure it out. Small group of people. That is no different from the Fed. Like, it's a small group of people doing their best to figure it out. That is what we are getting away from in Bitcoin. Like, the users control the monetary policy. It's set in stone. I can tell you how much Bitcoin is going to be minted this year, next year, 50 years, 100 years from now. Okay. That predictability, that credibility is something we've lacked as humans when it comes to money. And you add it to all the attributes it has at that individual level, of that peer-to-peer level, of just resisting confiscation and surveillance, and being able to be censorship resistant. It's just remarkable. So I mean, you start with Bitcoin. You could be Bitcoin first. What my belief is that a lot of the other experimentation happening on the other blockchains are kind of like test nets. All that stuff's going to come to Bitcoin. Like a really good example is stable coins. So stable coins are really important today, and they're all built on these like Ethereum or
coins.
Stable coin is okay. So you have let's take the US dollar. You have dollars that are like basically created and managed by the central bank and the banking system in the United States. Then you have euro dollars, which are created by banks outside of the United States, less regulation. A stable coin is like a private euro dollar, like even less regulated, but it's basically a digital asset pegged to the price of the dollar. And the peg is either held by a centralized party, like for example, Tether is a stable coin whose value is pegged by a bank called Deltec that takes real dollars in deposits, and then it issues tethers. Okay. That company's come under enormous scrutiny, and I think it should. And I think I don't know if Tether will collapse, but I think it certainly will fade. It will certainly not be around in 10 years. Like I think it's going to deteriorate. It'll either collapse or fade away. But the thing is, stablecoins are quite important today, and Bitcoin is not versatile enough at the moment to support stablecoins. So they're built on Ethereum or Tron or any of these other blockchains, right? Here's the thing. In the near future, Bitcoin is getting a program upgrade, a software upgrade called Taproot. It's coming at the end of this year. And once we have Taproot, do some really interesting stuff with smart contracts and Bitcoin, so that within the next couple of years, you'll be able to have a Bitcoin stable account. Like basically, like you'll have your phone totally disconnected from the banking system, no ID to you, no KYC, no ID, non-custodial, you control it. And you'll be able to go in your wallet and select, if you wish, to peg the value of your money to the dollar or the yen or the shekel or the peso or whatever. And on the back end, that'll be done with a market of people who are long Bitcoin versus people who want this fiat exposure. And that'll be managed by that wallet company. But this is like kind of amazing. So that's coming in the future. So this is an example of how Bitcoin will like take this innovation that has been experimented and iterated on other blockchains, and it'll bring it into Bitcoin. So, I mean, again, I think you can look to these other projects as like science experiments at best. I mean, that's being generous, because that's one role they serve. Okay, is like sort of test nets for Bitcoin, which is the world's open source money project. But in reality, you talk about 5,000 coins on CoinMarketCap. I mean, most of them are just straight up scams, pyramid schemes. I mean, they're all just ways for someone to take your Bitcoin. Here, send us your Bitcoin. We're going to give you these IOUs, and we promise they're going to be more in the future. Terrible idea. Okay, terrible idea. These are unregulated, securities. I mean, that usually don't have a productive company with capital stock behind it. I mean, it's, maybe you look in the top 10 and you want to argue, fine. But like 99.9% of these things are hugely dangerous and risky. So, I mean, I just think it's important to have a Bitcoin first approach. And then if you want to develop an understanding for what's going on in these other fields, you want to learn about Uniswap, you want to learn about Monero, go for it. And maybe it can help you. But like, it would be inadvisable to not at least have like a Bitcoin first approach, is my thought from what I've seen so far.
Yeah, and the question is like, what do you trust? Do you trust something that's truly open source where nobody's in charge? Or do you trust something that is heavily centralized and where certain few people can make the decisions?
Yeah, and like people at Uniswap will argue that it's decentralized. Well, okay, well, Uniswap's a company that has a legal team. Like, dude, they could get served. So, I mean, and yes, the code would live on, sure, but then you're like, it's a centralized entity, right? So that's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. There is no office in Menlo Park. There is no board. There is no foundation that took all the money. Like Ethereum was entirely pre-mined, right? Like when it came out, obviously. there is no small group of people who can benefit from the creation of this thing at the beginning. This is what we call the Cantalon Effect. The people closest to the money printer benefit first, and this is what we see as chronic in the fiat economy, right? This is why banks and corporations get bailed out before the individual. So same thing happens in the cryptocurrency space. Like the people closest to the money printer benefit the most. That is not the case in Bitcoin. We don't even know who's created it. It's unclear. And honestly, even if they came back today and sold their 1 million Bitcoins that we think they have, okay, they would crash the price. That's about it. They can't do anything else. If Satoshi came back today and said, I want to change it so that there's 42 million Bitcoin and not 21 million, we would tell them to screw off, or whoever they are. Sorry. No, we control it now. So this idea of user control is just unique to Bitcoin. Like no other digital asset has that. So that's why it's so important for me as a human rights activist.
Absolutely. And so some people are asking questions now regarding like the dark side of cryptocurrencies, which are, of course, how you and I would argue central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. So can you tell us a little bit more about like where do you see the threat, and can you like maybe like paint a dystopian picture where CBDCs would be abused, be abused so that people don't have freedoms anymore?
First of all, I think it's important we point out that like Bitcoin has a dark side too. Much like any neutral technology that's non-discriminatory, it cannot prevent people from using it. So you have to understand that Bitcoin's going to be like the internet or email or the mobile phone. Like it's going to empower bad people. I just don't think it's going to change human nature. Like I think it'll be about the same number of bad people that existed 10 years ago. Like you look at crime rate. Okay, I think in a Bitcoin world, the crime rate will be roughly the same. I mean, like there's going to be criminals. There's going to be people who try to steal and defraud and kidnap and attack and things like that. I mean, at that individual level, probably will be the same. Now, when it comes to nations fighting, we might see less of that. I think in a Bitcoin world, under a Bitcoin standard, this idea of a forever war, I don't think you can finance it anymore. So I think international conflict will actually be reduced, which is why when Jack Dorsey says Bitcoin will help bring peace, people make fun of him. But it's a pretty based comment. Like it actually is if you think about it, it'll that probably will happen. Now, when it comes to the dark side of the central bank digital currencies, I mean, there's no light side. I mean, they literally are just going to give the authorities more control over your money, and they're going to do, yes, of course, they're going to do censorship and blacklists, and they're going to discriminate, and they're going to socially engineer. But they're also going to do forced spending. They're going to have like expiration dates on the money. You have to spend it before a certain amount. And they're going to have negative interest rates, right? So they're going to discourage savings, right? So this is why Bitcoin is so important. Like, fine, you want to criticize Bitcoin in the comment section? Great. Let's wait 5 years. Let's see how you enjoy your negative interest rate account at the bank and your 60-day use it or lose it income. And then we'll talk. And then I think you'll be pretty excited that you can go into Bitcoin and have this Bitcoin backup. You need to consider it like a plan B. It's like a backup option. Like let the governments run their monetary experiments. Even if you believe in MMT and you think it's going to be the savior of the American economy, if we could just get rid of this idea that we have a fiscal cliff and we could just print as much money as we need to solve all of our problems, and then we'll get some inflation and we'll figure it out. If you believe in that, great, but you should have a backup option. Like just in case that doesn't work, you have Bitcoin, which is kind of my view. I think it's great if they want to print more money and give it directly to individuals as opposed to the banks. I think it's a great idea, but it could easily be disastrous. So that's why I'm happy that me and everybody that I know, we'll have the Bitcoin option. So if you want to go ahead and do that social experiment, by all means, be my guest. And I don't think you or I or anyone else here is going to have control over that. It seems like that's where it's heading. Like that's the direction that monetary policy is heading in. Just look at the balance sheet of the ECB. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. So, I mean, these countries are going to be buying. I mean, they're buying stocks. They're buying private assets. They're buying all kinds of. They're not just buying government bonds, man. I mean, they're getting very involved in the private economy. So we will see what happens there. But I mean, we can all have this plan B, which I think is quite important.
Yeah, I think recently the Bank of America said that the Federal Reserve every single hour of the day is buying roughly like a little bit over $300 million worth of
Yeah.
government debt. And then they're buying like also mortgages and everything, and they're propping up
Yeah.
the housing
So if
market.
you don't think that's going to cause inflation, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, good luck. Good luck. And you know what? Like, even if I'm wrong somehow, great. I'll have Bitcoin. Like, I have this backup, which is obviously doing very well over the last 5 years. So, I mean, I just think it's silly to like, what you owe yourself is to look at Bitcoin honestly, recognize its success so far, recognize that it's being used by more than, probably 200 million people, recognize that it does things nothing else can do, recognize that it's a major breakthrough scientifically, I mean, mathematically, like forget the economic side of it. You owe it to yourself to try to learn about it and understand it. I have no doubt that in the future, Bitcoin will be, if there are such thing as four-year colleges, it'll be a degree you take, the Bitcoin degree, and you'll do some computer science, you'll do some game theory, you'll do some monetary history, you'll do some coding, et cetera, but like you'll have a well-rounded 4-year degree in Bitcoin, and that will be offered by every university ever. And then there'll be like research and development programs at all the major universities. MIT already has one that looks at the, how do we strengthen the Bitcoin network long-term? That's coming down the road.
So that's a perfect ending for our conversation. So the last question I have for you is, where can people start learning about it? I mean, you've written a book, you should give that a shout out, but what other resources would you recommend? And also, what would you recommend to students specifically, how to get involved and how they could maybe also have an impact within the Bitcoin infrastructure and ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things. Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book called The Little Bitcoin Book with 7 other authors from around the world, and it's available in like 15 languages. So it's a good place to start. It's very basic. It's 100 pages, but it just gives you an idea of what you're dealing with. Beyond that, it depends on your interest. I mean, honestly, if you're American or you're in a country that buy $5 of Bitcoin and mess around with it, like move it to the Moon wallet, MUUN. It's a wallet made by a bunch of amazing guys and people down in Argentina. And it's an open source, non-KYC, non-custodial wallet. And you can send lightning payments to anyone in the world instantly. I mean, check it out, like use it, try it. That's the most important. If you don't try it, you're not going to appreciate it. Like there's a reason why all this media coverage is so negative, is because those reporters are prevented from owning Bitcoin. I think that the right way to do it would be to have 2 reporters that work for like the Wall Street Journal. One gets paid in Bitcoin, the other one gets paid in fiat. And then like that way the coverage would be balanced. Okay. Currently you only have like one side of the story. So you're watching these media outlets, they're putting out 95% negative coverage of Bitcoin. And that has a big impact on people's psyche. Like that has changed the world. That has prevented people from understanding what's going on with Bitcoin. It's very sad. So use it, learn about it. I've written a series of essays at Bitcoin Magazine. The latest one just came out like an hour ago about Palestine and Bitcoin. I'm looking at people using it in all different interesting like situations around the world. Maybe that'll help. Those are long, detailed essays that touch on political science and monetary policy and human rights. And if you're like a coder, you start with Andreas Antonopoulos' Mastering Bitcoin. Start there. Go take one of Jimmy Song's classes. Like there's so many resources today. It's amazing, actually. Follow me on Twitter and take a look at some of the people I'm following and maybe follow them. It's an amazing time in the world today where we can have just like this community of people. And it's a special moment. In 20 years, I don't think there's going to be a Bitcoin community really. Like today, there's not like an email community. We all use email. Like, why would we go to an email conference? It's just freaking email. It works. We don't ever stop to think about the political opinions of the people who created email. No, because we just use it and it's better than sending a letter in the mail. That's Bitcoin. Like in 20 years, you're not going to stop to think about the political beliefs of the people who started it. No, you're just going to use it because it's the best money. So let's kind of think that's the direction we're heading in. So prep yourselves for that. Thank you for having me, Wolf. And yeah, you guys can follow me on Twitter at Gladstein.
Well, Alex, thank you.
And definitely come to the Oslo Freedom Forum in Miami, October 4-5. We'd love to give some passes out to SFL folks, get them involved. We're going to have a ton of Latin American content, ton of Cuba content. We're going to have a whole day Bitcoin Academy. It's going to be an amazing event. I hope Wolf can come. It's going to be October 4-5. So you can apply to attend today at oslofreedomforum.com. And if you just note that you're part of the SFL community, we'll get you through.
Well, thank you so much for doing this and for setting up such a huge network where you have become such a force for liberty and for human rights across the world. And the stories I've listened to at the Oslo Freedom Forum, and from what I've heard from you, Alex, you have a whole room, 400, 500 people who are just moved to tears by what some other human beings went through.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are solutions being discussed, and actually action is being taken in order to remedy this. So it's a very important conference. It's a very important organization. Check out the Human Rights Foundation online on Twitter. Follow Alex Gladstein, of course, on Twitter as well. Besides that, check out Bitcoin, check out Students for Liberty, Learn Liberty on YouTube. Thank you so much for being here, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks, Alex.
Bye.
Bye-bye.